Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. Midnight shift employees of Reddit. What's the creepiest experience you've had during your nighttime shift? Story 1. Creeping shadows.
I worked the night shift as a security guard at a cemetery, always alone. The nights were long and eerily quiet, but nothing prepared me for this particular encounter. One evening, during my rounds, I noticed something unusual. The metal gate to one of the old underground tunnels was slightly ajar. These tunnels, used to store high-value equipment, were supposed to be locked at all times. The policy was clear: if I found an unlocked door or gate, I was required to enter and secure the area. Only if I found something truly suspicious would I call the police. It was not uncommon to find gates left unlocked due to human error, but that night felt different. As I approached the tunnel, I froze. Faint voices echoed from the darkness within. My chest tightened, and every rational part of me wanted to call for help immediately, but protocol dictated otherwise. Armed only with a flashlight, I stepped into the tunnel, my every movement cautious. The air inside was cold and damp, and the beam of my flashlight barely cut through the suffocating darkness. My footsteps echoed ominously against the concrete walls, amplifying the unsettling silence between the faint murmurs. I followed the voices deeper into the tunnel, my imagination running wild with every step. Were these intruders? Was someone in danger? My grip tightened on the flashlight as I rounded a corner, the voices growing louder. As I moved closer, the sound became clearer, words blending into a strange, distorted melody. Finally, I turned another corner and found the source of the sound. A small, portable radio sat on a shelf, left on and playing faint, static-filled voices. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Why was the radio on? Who had left it there? And as I turned to leave, I could not shake the feeling of being watched. The tunnel suddenly felt heavier, the darkness thicker, as if it were alive. I locked the gate behind me and finished my shift. But to this day, the memory of those voices in the tunnel lingers, and I wonder if the radio was truly the only thing making noise that night.
Story 2. Voice from the past.
It was the dead of night, and I was working the night shift at a very old hospital. This place was small, dimly lit, and had a history that made it feel eerie. I received the report from my patient, a non-verbal individual with advanced dementia, unable to speak an intelligible word for years, just grunting and moaning. I had no idea what to expect as I prepared to monitor them. Hours passed, and I spent my time trying to regulate the patient's heart rhythm with a cardiac drip. At around 2:30 a.m., something went terribly wrong. I glanced at the monitor and saw a lethal rhythm, ventricular tachycardia, or VTAC. My heart raced as I rushed into the room to check on the patient. But as I looked back at the monitor, the rhythm had mysteriously returned to normal. Suddenly, the power in the entire building flickered briefly, casting an unsettling shadow over the room. Just then, the patient spoke, a voice clear as day. "I was born in 1895. I need to go home." They repeated it several times, sending a chill down my spine. I stood frozen in shock. This was a person who hadn't spoken a coherent word in years. I had to be hearing things. I quickly grabbed another nurse to confirm what I had just witnessed. When we returned, the patient was back to their usual state, muttering incoherent sounds as they had when I first assessed them. I couldn't shake the feeling that something inexplicable had just occurred. I still can't explain it. I don't believe in ghosts or supernatural events, but after that night, I couldn't help but wonder, was it just the medication, or had I truly witnessed something beyond comprehension?
Story 3. The Silent Stare.
My partner spent some time working in a psychiatric unit that housed patients whose needs or behavior were too extreme to be managed in a less secure facility. Not all the patients had mental health conditions, though there were a couple of people suffering from brain injuries due to accidents or substance abuse, as well as a few with advanced dementia who were too much to handle in a regular care home. One of these patients, a man named Jeffrey, had early onset dementia. He hadn't spoken a word in years, but he was still ambulatory. He could walk around just fine and was surprisingly strong for his condition. This made things difficult on the days when he was uncooperative, but he usually spent his time just standing by the window, staring into the empty distance. One evening, my partner went into Jeffrey's room for her usual duties. She began with her standard greeting, "Hello, Jeffrey. It's time for you to have some dinner. Let's get you ready." But as she said that, something unexpected happened. Jeffrey slowly turned around to look at her, his eyes flickering for the first time in what seemed like forever. It was as if he had heard her, responding to her presence in a way he hadn't done in years. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. The real shock came next. Jeffrey, with clarity in his voice, looked at her and said, "Oh, hello. I was just thinking about." He trailed off, his expression suddenly shifting back into the vacant, faraway look he usually had. Then, as if nothing had happened, he slowly turned back to the window, once again retreating into whatever mental fog his mind had trapped him in for so long. My partner was frozen. She stood there, unsure of what had just occurred. Was it a moment of clarity, or something darker? She tried to engage him again, but Jeffrey was already back to his previous state, muttering unintelligible sounds. It was as though the man who had spoken so clearly moments before had vanished entirely. Confused and shaken, my partner asked the other staff members if they had ever seen Jeffrey speak like that. Some of them were skeptical, saying they'd never heard him utter a word in all the time they'd worked there. It was as if Jeffrey had been possessed by some strange, fleeting awareness that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The human mind is a mysterious and powerful thing, especially when it begins to break down. Sometimes the things we think we understand the least are the ones that end up being the most terrifying. Was Jeffrey's brief moment of clarity a sign of something lost and long forgotten? Or had something far darker entered the old, haunted walls of the psychiatric unit, using Jeffrey's body as a vessel? No one will ever know for sure. But one thing was clear: not everything in the world of the mind is as it seems.
Story 4. Unseen Eyes.
I worked security for a local security company that was just starting up, specializing in monitoring heavy levy equipment out in the orchards. I had no radio, no gun, no mace, no flashlight, and no phone service. My job was strictly to monitor and take note. But if anything did happen, the nearest help was 30 to 45 minutes away in town. A few weeks into my night shifts along the levee, which was surrounded by orchard, I became pretty comfortable in my new location. It had only one road in, and one road out as the only entrance for miles. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I heard an alarm clock going off somewhere in the murky darkness. I was positioned along the levee with my car on the right and the levee in the middle. The alarm sound was coming from the left side. I turned on my car and drove over the levee toward the workers' portable office container, where the sound seemed to originate. As my dim high beams swept across the orchard, I saw a dark figure multiple rows back, quickly fading behind a tree. I stopped and stared into the darkness, barely disturbed by my car's headlights. Nothing moved, and I could still hear the alarm going off. I got out of my car and, using my phone's light, I found the source. A small, battery-powered alarm clock sat on a white plastic table, blaring away. My brain screamed at me to return to my car. I quickly removed the batteries from the alarm and jumped back into my car as the silence returned to the orchards. As I reversed out of the spot, my headlights illuminated the trees again. The same shape, now 3 or 4 rows closer, seemed to crouch behind another tree. I sat there for a moment, staring into the darkness before my brain screamed, "What if there are more? And this is the distraction?" That thought made me back up onto the high part of the levee, where I waited alone for the next 3.5 hours. It felt torturous, like 1,000 eyes were burrowing into every square inch of my car and soul from every angle. The silence of the orchard was unsettling, especially in the winter when no insects or wildlife wander about. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart for the next several hours. I almost wanted some monster to come crashing through the trees, yelling, "Here I am, here to eat you." But nothing came. When the morning shift arrived, he casually drank his hot cup of coffee as I gave him the rundown, while the sun began to rise. We decided to investigate further into the orchard. We ended up at the spot where I had seen the figure. After some quick scanning, he found large boot prints pacing back and forth in a line along one row of trees. We followed them, and they led forward toward the workers' office container, where they abruptly stopped near a tree, a few rows back. There were no follow-up footprints leading forward or backward, and no vehicle tracks leaving the area. No one could have gotten past me without trudging through the orchard. It was as if someone had appeared, paced back and forth for hours, walked forward, and then disappeared without a trace. We reported it to the boss, who shrugged it off, suggesting it might have been an elaborate prank by the construction workers. However, that was one of the last shifts I worked doing security.
Story 5. Blinded by the van.
I had just graduated from college and started working at a property management company. The day before, I had done a showing at one of the properties. And in the rush of the day, I accidentally took the keys home with me. I realized around 1 a.m. that I still had them. And since there was another showing scheduled for 8 a.m. the next day, I knew I had to return the keys. I wasn't starting my shift until the afternoon, so I decided to drive back and drop them off in the office park, where our office was located. It was only a 10-minute drive, but when I got there, the office park was completely deserted except for a few cars scattered in the parking lot. I parked and got out of my car, heading toward the door. That's when I noticed something strange. A white van had suddenly turned on its engine, and the high beams flashed on, blinding me. My heart raced as the light from the van's headlights bore down on me, I hurried the last few steps, dropped the keys into the chute, and practically ran back to my car, hoping the van would just leave me alone. As I drove away, my heart was still pounding, but the van didn't drive off. Instead, it followed me, slowly creeping all the way to the edge of the parking lot before stopping. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. My mind raced with terrifying possibilities. What if the driver had bad intentions? I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just a security guard on a break, trying to see what I was doing. But when I told my boss about the incident, he told me there was no security at the office park. He spoke to the police, and they promised to patrol the area more often that week. But from that night on, the van never appeared again. I don't know what the driver's intentions were, but I'm relieved I never had to find out.
Story 6. Look who's watching you.
I had been working graveyard shifts as a driver for a well-known company for about 3 months when something unsettling happened. Until then, I had never felt uneasy at the warehouse. But on one particular night, around 2 a.m., something felt off. It was as if I was being watched. I was the only one at the warehouse. And while we had security monitoring us via CCTV, they were not on site. It was just a warehouse where we stored products to ship out. The night was quiet as I was picking up items to deliver to stores, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. I kept pausing and looking around the parking lot and the surrounding warehouses. There was not a single sound, just the wind and the occasional chirp of crickets. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. I felt increasingly uneasy. I decided to secure the warehouse doors, lock my truck, and step inside to take a quick break. As I was in the bathroom, I received an alert on my phone. It was security calling. I ignored the first 3 calls, but by the 4th call, I finally answered. "Mr. Steam Shovel, we've detected movement inside the warehouse. Are you secure? What is your current position?" I assured them I was not inside the warehouse and that the doors were all secure. They made a note of the active alarm system and confirmed that the doors outside the warehouse were closed. They said they would check the cameras and call me back. I continued finishing up my break, trying to brush off the chills running down my spine. When they called back, I was looking outside the warehouse, and everything seemed normal. There was nothing amiss, but I still felt that strange sensation. "Mr. Steam Shovel, we've detected movement again. The sensors are picking up activity in the warehouse. Are you inside?" I was now standing outside the warehouse looking around and saw nothing. "Nothing is here," I reported, feeling uneasy. My skin prickled with goosebumps. The security team assured me they would check the cameras again, and I decided to leave the warehouse and get my delivery done. I quickly ran to my truck and drove off. I was gone for about 2 hours. During that time, they called me once again, saying movement had been detected inside, but they couldn't find anything on the cameras. When I returned to the warehouse, I was alone. As I went about breaking down cardboard boxes and doing my usual tasks, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if someone was lurking around the corner, silently observing me. I couldn't shake the feeling. Before my shift ended, I received a text message from my boss asking to meet before I started my shift. Long story short, he told me that someone had died in the warehouse about 10 years ago and that it was believed to be haunted. We walked into the warehouse together, and when we reached the bins, he stopped without me saying anything. "This is where I always feel like someone is watching me," he said. I never had another experience like that night, but I've never quite been able to shake that feeling when I think back on it.
Story 7. Vanishing Passenger.
I do not believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. I'm a skeptic, okay? When I was 21 or 22, I worked the graveyard shift as a cashier at the Chevron gas station at 82nd and Burnside in Portland, Oregon. Some people called it the ghetto, but honestly, there is no ghetto in Portland. One night, in the dead of winter, I was outside smoking a cigarette, tucked off to the side of the building so as not to light up the place. There wasn't much traffic since it was after 3 a.m., and the bars had closed at 2. Suddenly, from the northeast, a radio cab pulled into the lot. They came in a little fast. Some of those taxi drivers were a bit reckless. So I was ready to deal with a cranky, tired driver. The driver was an older white man, portly and bald. He looked very upset, but also somewhat confused. I might have been projecting, but I only caught a glimpse of his face as he pulled in. He stopped just long enough for the passenger to get out. The moment the door opened, the driver sped off, lurching forward and driving west on Burnside Avenue. The man who got out seemed normal enough. A little handsome, not drunk, wearing black slacks and a button-down shirt, plus a leather jacket, not the cool motorcycle type, but the kind Adam Scott might wear. I stubbed out my cigarette and walked toward him, opening the door to the convenience store to invite him inside. He looked a little embarrassed, ruffling the hair at the back of his head as he declined to come in. Instead, he asked if I could call him another cab. What was wrong with the last one? I joked. He laughed, then said, "I don't know, the guy just yelled at me to get out. Maybe he got a better fare." It struck me as odd, so I went inside to grab the cordless phone. It wasn't the days of smartphones yet, but cell phones existed. I dialed the number for Radio Cab, one I knew by heart. The dispatcher answered as I was walking back across the store. She asked the location, which I gave her, then asked for the passenger's name. "Oh, wait," I said. "Let me go ask." I was already at the door when I stepped outside, calling to the passenger. "Hey," I began, only to realize he was no longer standing there. "Ah," I said to dispatch. "Hold on, I have to find the guy." The building was small, with a Safeway behind it that had a large parking lot wrapping around 2 sides. The other 2 sides were bordered by 82nd Avenue and Burnside Street. There was a Walgreens across the street and some used car lots further down. There was nowhere for the guy to hide or run off to. I walked out onto the sidewalk, looking both ways. I checked the dumpster. I even walked into the Safeway parking lot. The man was gone. In the snow, no less. I shared all this with the dispatcher, who seemed amused but also a bit intrigued. I described the drop-off and narrated my search. "That's weird," she said. "What did the driver look like?" I gave her the same description I've shared with you. I heard her typing away, and there were other dispatchers in the background. "There aren't a lot of drivers out right now, especially this late. I only show one in the area," she said, trailing off. "And?" I asked, feeling confused and eager to solve this mystery. "The only driver in the area right now is a black woman," she told me. We both were confused, and honestly, a little uneasy. She gave me her extension to call back if I figured anything out, telling me she'd be off around 7 a.m. I never saw the man again. I didn't call the dispatcher back. That was it. There's nothing else to the story. I didn't stock the cooler until my relief came in. Honestly, I was the only one in that store that night, and I was perfectly fine continuing to believe that.
Story 8. Ghostly presence in the office.
I used to work in audit, which meant a lot of late nights, 2 a.m. or later. Working overnight was not uncommon. Our office tower was the first true skyscraper built in that city and was the tallest building around for many years. Naturally, it became a popular spot for suicides for many years. It was haunted. During the day, when office workers were everywhere, it was pretty much normal. Late at night, after 11 p.m. or so, the building would feel very different. The way the office was set up was that low-level audit employees like us didn't have assigned desks but had 3 rows of long tables for floating stations. We faced each other with a divider down the middle of the tables, creating 6 rows of seating. Teams often worked late, and even after midnight, it was common for 1 or 2 teams to be in the office. For some strange reason, even if we started the evening spread out across all the rows, we would end up clustered together on the last 2 rows by the end. The senior auditors had experienced plenty of strange occurrences, and some became pretty numb to it. The seniors would insist we all leave together, accompany each other to the restrooms, even the men, and that no one was to work late alone. One time it was only my team of 4 working late, past 1 a.m. At that point, we were busy typing away at our laptops, flipping through papers, occasionally leaning back in our chairs to ask a question. Suddenly we started hearing typing coming from a different corner of the office. It started when we started and stopped when we stopped. Spooked, the senior auditor told us to ignore it and quickly finish up. We hurriedly picked up the pace and tried our best to ignore the phantom typing. After that, we started hearing rustling paper and small thumps getting louder, like files or documents being dropped on a table. At this point, we were getting freaked out. The office seemed dark even though it was brightly lit, and there was this terrible feeling in the air. Without saying a word, we started packing our things because we weren't paid enough to deal with this. Suddenly, the lights above the rows in front of us flickered, and we all gasped in fear. We stared wide-eyed at the front rows when one of the office chairs turned and rolled from pretty much the left side to the right side of the office. We bolted out of the office. Forget the laptops and papers. We just grabbed our phones, keys, and anything else we needed and ran out of there. We didn't even turn off the lights. The next morning we were back in the office like nothing happened. After that experience, I made it a point to leave by midnight. I'd rather work on things from home than stay in that office late.
Story 9. Man with the syringe.
Several decades ago, I worked the night shift at a corner store in one of the more dangerous parts of town. The area was rough, and I quickly became accustomed to the unpredictable nature of working late hours. However, one night stands out as my creepiest experience by far. It was a typical quiet night, with the store empty and the occasional car driving by. But then, the glass door slid open, and in walked a man. He was half naked, his skin was sickly thin, and his eyes were wild. I instantly recognized him. This wasn't the first time he had wandered into the store, but this night, something was different. In his hand, he held a syringe filled with blood. The sight of it made my heart stop. Over the years, I had been held up a few times by people carrying knives, baseball bats, even a gun. But never a syringe. The terror it caused was unlike anything I'd ever felt. The man, clearly high and out of his mind, didn't seem to know where he was or what he was doing, but he was making demands. "Give me everything you have," he muttered, his voice erratic. I froze, terrified. In those moments, I couldn't think straight. I had $50 in the till, the cash I usually kept on hand, and a few packs of cigarettes. I handed them over as quickly as I could. My fear intensified as he left, taking the money and cigarettes, still holding that syringe. Thankfully, the police arrived quickly after I called them. They knew him well. It turned out the syringe contained his own blood, and he was not only HIV positive, but also had hepatitis C and other serious conditions. He was eventually taken to a psychiatric ward. That experience haunted me for a long time. I've never been so scared in my life.
Story 10. Echoes in the Dark.
I used to work at a private resort in Bali. Anyone who's been to Bali knows that the island holds a strange and mystical charm, almost as if every inch of the land is infused with a perfect balance of both something eerie and something calming. It's hard to describe, but you can feel it in the air. One night, I had to work a 3 a.m. shift because a guest had booked a sunrise fishing tour and wanted me as the guide. The resort itself was beautiful, but the office where I had to prepare was separate from the main resort area, nestled far away from the lively parts of the property. To get to my office, I had to walk about 300 meters from the lobby down a narrow cobblestone path, flanked by huge, old trees. Along the way, I passed by the resort's large Hindu temple, its silhouette barely visible in the dark. The property was vast and mostly undeveloped, filled with overgrown trees and shrubs. Since the resort was built on Tanahadat, sacred land, which required certain parts to remain untouched, the place felt even more isolated at 3 a.m. The entire resort was empty. The only other person on site was a lone security guard stationed near the parking lot, far away from the building. I walked into the office, the large door creaking as I entered. The office was dimly lit by the glow of a single desk lamp. The silence in the air felt oppressive. I clocked in using the fingerprint machine near the front door, placed my bag down, and sat at my desk. The building was eerily still. It was then I heard it, a loud, mechanical voice from the machine that repeated, "Repeat again, repeat again." This wasn't unusual. It was the message that played when someone whose fingerprint hadn't been registered tried to clock in. But I was the only one there, and I had clocked in just fine. The voice continued for a minute, each repetition growing more unsettling. I opened the door to investigate. The corridor outside was pitch black, save for the faint moonlight creeping through the trees. There was no one there, not a sound except for the rustling of leaves in the wind. I closed the door and sat back down, trying to ignore it. But as soon as I settled back into my chair, the machine blared again, repeat again, repeat again. My heart raced, and a chill crawled up my spine. Confused and a little annoyed, I stood up and opened the door, calling out loudly, "Stop playing around. I'm trying to work here." For a moment, Everything was silent. The machine was quiet. The stillness outside was complete, with only the distant sound of the trees swaying in the wind. But when I sat back down at my desk, the machine repeated the same thing for a third time. Repeat again, repeat again. At this point, fear took over. I stood up, not wanting to feel that overwhelming sense of dread any longer, and left the office for good. The rest of the shift passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been trying to communicate with me. That night marked the end of my sunrise tours. I couldn't bring myself to go back, not after that eerie encounter.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.